A my máme před sebou blok teďkon před obědem, kdy řešíme posledního covidem postiženého řečníka, spolupracovnice, partnerka Dale'a Stricklera, která máme opět přetočenou přednášku, opět stejným systémem budeme mít možnost vyřešit otázky, připojí se i Dale na odpovědi. Takže mi dovolte, abych tady představil doktorku Elizabeth Heilmanová. Je to profesorka z Wichita State University a věnuje se tématům, jako je šetrné ekologické zemědělství, odolnost komunit a politická opatření. A ona má pro nás připravenou předtočenou přednášku na téma regenerativní zemědělství jako klíčový nástroj v boji se suchem. Já bych poprosil režii o video a po něm se vrátíme k otázkám.
This is Elizabeth Heilmanová from Wichita State University, and I'm going to talk about how regenerative agriculture is a key tool in the fight against drought. A core principle is that 40% of weather is caused by local variables. This means when you regenerate on your farm and in your community, you can heal the water cycle. This picture of the Loess Plateau gives you an idea of what 40% local weather variables looks like. It's pretty different. Plants, weather, and climate are critically linked, and we know this from global metadata, especially with new innovations in sensing data. This is another picture of the Loess Plateau in China, and you can see on the right, this is the exact same picture, the same location about 20 years later. They regenerated 3.5 million hectares, and there's an enormous difference in the before and after. So it's 12.4% more precipitation. Humidity increased by between about 15 and 19%, and temperature went down about 6 degrees a day in the summer between June and September. Farmers' incomes doubled and employment diversified. So where does that 40% variability come from? Most of it, 30%, comes from vegetation. And then the other 10 to 30% is related to soil health and soil moisture. Now those factors intersect, so they're not additive. Here's another example. Rancher Alejandro Correo and his neighbors in the Chihuahua Desert of Mexico over about 20 years made about 20% more rain. Now, other factors influence your weather. Those are landforms, bodies of water, altitude, longitude, latitude, wind patterns. But what's important to know is that as little as 15 square kilometers, that can be enough to create a microclimate. So how does this happen? First, more rain will come down. And this happens with more plants that give biogenic aerosols. The second principle is that more rain needs to go into the soil. And this happens with healthier soil that infiltrates the water. The third principle is that you have to stop evaporation. And finally, you want more water to go into the atmosphere, but that should happen steadily and regularly through the transpiration of plants. So let's start with the first principle. You can grow cloud seeds called biogenic aerosols on your farm and in your region. And to explain this, let's revisit the water cycle. So the picture on the upper left shows a water cycle that we're familiar with, and it shows water going from the land, becoming mist, being in clouds, and going back. What you need to understand on this slide is that water condenses onto something called a cloud condensation nuclei, and that is the cloud seed. And these vary. So there's two major types. One is called biogenic, and it comes from nature. And the other is anthropogenic. It's dust and pollution, mostly from human activity. Now, dust is natural, but human beings have created vastly more dust with things like tillage and forest fires. Now, about half of these biogenic aerosols, half of aerosols in general, will stay local. Biogenic aerosols are bigger, and they're more likely to stay local. Dust and pollution is more likely to go up through these higher clouds and float very far away, sometimes very quickly. And that's why we can have haze from a forest fire hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Regular gentle rain is increased by these large biogenic aerosols being steadily released in your region. So what are they? Globally, the number one is fungi. Then we have pollen, volatile organic compounds, which I'll explain, and bacteria that grow on leaf surfaces. So fungal spores are very, very important to rainmaking. And for fungal spores, we need shade. So that means we need crop litter, we need mulch. And fungal spores can be from mushrooms, but they can also be little tiny particles that grow whenever you have something organic matter and we smell that must. That's little tiny fungal spores that are very important for rainmaking. Pollen is another important biogenic aerosol, and you would do best to have more than one source of pollen on your farm. We know when a corn crop comes and it pollinates that a rain shortly follows. But if that's all that you're growing in a year, then that's the only pollen that you're contributing to make these important biogenic aerosols. So the more diverse plants are in a pasture, the more diversity is on a farm as a crop or as a cover crop or in edge areas, the more biogenic aerosols. Another source of biogenic aerosol are volatile organic compounds. Anytime you smell something pungent in nature, that's a biogenic aerosol. And that is the smell of pines. That is the smell of lemon. Also, when flowers pollinate and attract insects, that smell is a volatile organic compound. And those molecules create aerosols that promote rain. A fourth source of biogenic aerosols are the bacteria that grow on leaf surfaces. And one of the most famous is Pseudomonas syringae, because that is what is used in snowmaking. But there are more than 10,000 different bacteria that grow on leaves that contribute to biogenic aerosols. So let's go back and look at this. Now, rain is suppressed by dust and pollution, and it's promoted by these biogenic aerosols. Why? The size is very different. They can be 10 times, even 100 times smaller when it's pollution or dust. And that means it's very difficult for the condensation nuclei to attract water vapor. They cannot collide together to make heavy enough droplets to become raindrops, and they tend to make haze instead. Heavily polluted clouds evaporate much of their water before precipitation can occur. So this picture shows us the difference between a small droplet and a larger droplet. Just like children get colder than adults because they have more surface area, then these smaller droplets, they are evaporating on their surface, and they're inefficient as cloud condensation nuclei. Dust and pollution are small, they go high, and they suppress normal rainfall events. Dust stays as haze before finally falling, and it's intense dumping cold rain. Biogenic aerosols promote warm, slow, steady, regular, gentle rain. In some places, rain amount is the same, but it comes differently. It comes in these intense, short bursts, and it's very difficult for soil to absorb an intense rainfall. This shows 1901 to 1960, and you can see the changes in heavy rainfall, many more. Globally, less vegetation, shade, and mulch, and more dust means and pollution mean that there are fewer warm, steady, normal rains. Now, globally, we have about a third of the land is in desert, of course, full of dust. And all deserts that are devoid of life, like the Sahara, the Arabian Desert, the Great Australian Desert, and the Gobi, these are man-made. You can see that the places where agriculture began in Mesopotamia and the Middle East have become completely turned into desert. They are desertified. Now, humans have been degrading Europe's landscapes with deforestation, overgrazing, tillage, and foul since the first agricultural societies over 5,000 years ago. And you can see between 1000 BC and much more recently, the difference in vegetation across Europe. Why? Well, humans have been using the same bad farming techniques for 10,000 years. And when we ruin our soil, we tend to invade a new place and then ruin more soil. So what inhibits biogenic rain seeds? Bare soil means nothing is growing to make those biogenic aerosols. Bare soil blows away as dust, and that inhibits rain. And when it does rain, it's those big, intense rains that tend to cause floods. Tilled soil often lacks crop litter for fungi habitat. Monocrops don't provide diverse pollens. Pastures that have low plant diversity don't provide diverse grass pollens. Overgrazed pasture lacks healthy fungi populations. When woods and transitional zones are cut back, nothing is growing. And across the world, public parks, schoolyards, suburban yards are typically biologically bleak. Tilled soil makes dust and pollution with these small particles. So the next principle is that we want our rain to go in. We need to work to keep more of the rainfall that you're getting with healthy soil that will infiltrate. So stopping tillage, maintaining life above the ground with plant coverage, and maintaining life below the ground with live roots, rhizospheres, and over 500,000 soil bacteria and mycorrhizal fungi networks, nematodes and worms. All of this will help us increase soil organic matter and help infiltrate the water. This is an example from western Oklahoma, a state in the United States, that shows on the left cover crops and no-till, and you can see the rain all went in. And on the right, we have tillage, and you can see the water just sitting on top of the ground. So what is this like across the state in a year? A study was done. I want you to guess what percent of the rain in a year in Oklahoma ran off, what percent was evaporated, and what percent of the rain was actually used by the crop. So this area is 181 square kilometers. That gives you an idea of how it compares to the Czech Republic. And in Oklahoma, about 30% of the land is no-till. The US average is 40% no-till. So are you thinking of what percent that could be? I'll give you the answer in a moment. Here's the answer. Only 18% of the rain was actually used by the crop. 59% was evaporated, and 23% of that water that came down just ran off. Why? Well, infiltration is created by soil biology. So the type, amount, and functionality of root exudates interacting with soil bacteria, fungi, and the soil humus affect the pore space and the aggregation formation. So you want to have a whole city of life underground to create that pore space. Now this is the effects of tillage on infiltration. This has been studied for a long time. You'll see that no-till got 2.7 more milliliters per minute. That's 108% more water infiltration than a moldboard plow. So compacted soil acts like a brick and it restricts water and root infiltration, and uncompacted soil with healthy biology acts like a sponge. So maintaining an ecosystem of life below the ground with live roots, and again, that healthy rhizosphere and bacteria, all of that increases the soil organic matter and the infiltration. Now, it might seem like that's very difficult to do. These two pictures are from Kansas. They're from our farm, managed by Dale Strickler. And then you can see the soil organic matter before was very low when we bought the land. This slide shows 15 years later, after regenerative farming, and the soil organic matter was increased 8.7%. Every 1% increase of soil organic matter increases the water holding capacity by 95,000 liters. And that is per acre, which corresponds to 0.4 hectare. Now also, healthy soil would have mycorrhizal fungi in it. If you're tilling, you are killing that life off. So mycorrhizal fungi difference tends to be about 30% more water being able to be used by plants. The right side of this field is treated with mycorrhizal fungi, the left is not, and you can see the difference in the health of the plants. And also you can see the difference in what must be transpiring. So soil health and moisture globally are correlated with somewhere between 10% and well over 30% increase in precipitation, depending on other variables. That's a lot. 3, we need for the water to stay in by stopping evaporation. Evaporation is a function of soil temperature and wind speed at the soil surface. So take a look at this picture. On the left, you see tillage, and it's right after a rain, and you can see that that moisture is going straight back up into the sky. And on the right, with plant cover, we don't see that same mist. Let's look at temperature differences. This is a conversion between Fahrenheit and Celsius. In August, the air was 36.4 degrees. Bare tilled soil was 47.3 degrees. No-till cover crop soil was only 27 degrees. This is all on the same day. Take those figures and extrapolate through Europe and through the whole world. And of course, there's an enormous effect. This is tilled soil. And then across the road on the same day, this is no-till soil. And you're able to squeeze it and get some moisture instead of just looking at dust. This is a study from Kansas, and it shows that on average, no-till will increase the water with less evaporation by 1.27 millimeters. No crop litter and thus evaporation in this picture. And again, this is just across the street showing crop litter, less evaporation, and a healthier crop. The fourth principle is that water needs to steadily go back up. The picture there on the left is from the Czech Republic. Every area should be covered with as much plant diversity as possible. We make more regular rain with slow and steady transpiration in all seasons by increasing plant diversity, the total amount of vegetation, and then ecosystem functioning, including insects and animals. And when it happens in the whole nation, we dramatically improve the water cycle. We need to replant all of Europe. 40% of weather is local. It's based on these local differences, and we can regrow water cycle stability. It's in your hands. We need to partner with nature, protect soil, promote diversity, and use holistic methods. And then we have gone a long way towards ending drought and ending flood as well. In the United States, regenerative farming methods were overwhelmingly invented by farmers. They didn't come from the university, and they weren't always supported by the government. Farmers began to do regenerative practice more and more because it works, because you can make more money, and it's incredibly gratifying to see your farm's ecosystems becoming healthier and healthier. Farmers have an enormous amount of stress. It's one of the most unpredictable, high-stress occupations on the planet, and that means it's extra difficult to try something new. Something new might sound good intellectually, but feel extremely risky. So as you're contemplating these methods, you need to know that it's normal to feel incredibly anxious about it. One of the things that we do in the United States is we work with farmers to deal with how anxious they feel when trying new methods. I want you all to work together in your communities because I want you to change your microclimate. So that means not just changing your individual farms, but work with each other to change that regional climate. When you work with each other and talk to each other and share ideas and experiences and maybe equipment, it's also going to make this transition easier emotionally because big changes are difficult. We have been farming essentially the same way for 10,000 years, and we can farm completely differently with nature, and it will earn us a lot more money, and it will stabilize the climate, and we stop doing an extractive system where we're depleting our soils. The future is in your hands. You can change your farm, you can change the climate of your entire country, and you can help reverse global warming. So good luck. You can do it. Thank you very much.
Let's fix this.
A já vítám zpátky Dale Stricklera a Elizabeth Heilmanová. Thank you very much for Thank you very much for joining us for the Q&As. So I'll switch to Czech for a little while now. Takže opět můžete pokládat otázky v češtině, stejný proces jako předtím. Já tady moc krát děkuji za upozornění. Já se pokusím nestát v cestě titulkům, takže budu někde tady zhruba na kraji, aby všichni viděli. Takže máte nějaké dotazy k přednášce? Já zatím teda, než se rozmyslíte, tak já vykopnu s prvním. Elizabeth, I would have first question, and that is, there was a 15 square kilometers, which in my mind is something like 1,500 hectares, which is kind of a bigger farm here. So are you telling me that people who have 1,500 hectares here can change the weather, create their own weather?
Well, it's usually in the United States that would also be exceptionally large. And so we see these changes happening when multiple farmers begin regenerative practices in a region. Now, some of these have been carefully studied, like on the Loess Plateau of China. Places we can look at the data for weather, and we can see that there have been enough regenerative practices that a county, a smaller region, gets more rain than its neighbors. So, for example, northern Oklahoma, directly south of where I live, has more rain than the neighboring counties, and it has more rain than before these farmers began doing regenerative practice, if you look at 20 years of data. Now, that's not one farm. That's hundreds of farms. And it isn't every single farm. It's about 75% of the land has been significantly regenerated and is regularly covered with either a crop, a pasture, or a cover crop. So what makes a difference in how many acres or hectares you need has to do with the landforms. So if you're in a high plateau in a windier area, it takes more. And if you're in a more protected area, then cloud covers tend to be lower and it takes less. So landforms do make a difference, but there are also areas that are even smaller than that, where people observe microclimate changes. Climate has tended to be analyzed by physicists, and it's very difficult for them to make small-scale generalizations because there isn't even the same types of aerosols over one town, let alone one region. They're highly diverse. Does that make sense?
Perfect
Does that
sense.
answer the question?
Thank you very much. Já se zeptám, jestli už tady máme otázky v sále. Tak začneme tady vepředu, prosím počkejte na mikrofon. Mikrofon, prosím, tady dopředu, tady. A pak budeme pokračovat. Tady dopředu.
Považují naši přednášející za účelné v procesu transformace nebo později zasáhnout ty lidi, to znamená udělat třeba striptil, nebo teda nějaké opatření na zpracování půdy, nebo taková situace podle nich nenastává.
Takže jestli je potřeba v procesu toho přechodu...
Jestli se najde situace, kdy je třeba...
Pokračovat se zpracováním...
Nepokračovat, ale udělat tu operaci, třeba striptil nebo jinou operaci zpracování půdy.
So the question for you, for both of you is, during the transition from the conventional to the regenerative practice, are there some examples where you actually need to go into the soil and mechanically do, for example, strip-till or some other practice? Are there specific occasions where it's actually needed in the transition?
It can be helpful. Many people have used that, doing strip-till particularly in northern areas where the warmer temperature of tilled soil makes a difference. Most people are not doing that anymore. That was very common at one time. They found it's not as necessary as we once thought it might be. One of the prevailing thoughts at one time was that compaction, compacted layer below the soil, what we call the plow pan, would be a limiting factor, and that we would benefit from mechanical disturbance, subsoiling operation to break that compacted layer. And that we found that that's not as necessary as we once thought, that we can do a better job breaking compaction by encouraging earthworms, dung beetles, and roots of cover crops to break that compacted layer rather than mechanical tillage. So, the biggest benefit is psychological benefit to those practices. It helps us emotionally more than it helps us agronomically, which can be important.
And the broader principle holds is to consider what are the ways that nature will break that up, right? And soil biology is invisible, and yet that's a very powerful factor to create airspace in your soil. And then roots, cover crop roots, will also create pore space.
Okay, thank you very much. Takže možná mechanické zpracování více jako emoční podpora, než to, že by to nešlo i nějakým jiným způsobem. Takže i příroda má své způsoby, jak rozrušit utužení a tak dále. Já se ptám, tam máme někde další mikrofon? Poprosím.
Bych se chtěl zeptat, kolik procent zemědělské půdy, ať už orný nebo pastvin, je v současné době v Americe obhospodařováno regenerativně?
So what is the percentage in the United States? How much of the land is being, what's the regenerative practice? How much land in regenerative practice and how much land is in the conventional? Do you know the percentage points on that one?
Yes, in the United States, about 40% of the land is no-till and on some degree of regenerative practice. And it's dramatically increasing. And that dramatic upturn started about 10 years ago. And so every year there's quite a lot more. Part of the reason is that inputs have become very much more expensive. Fertilizer is very expensive. And farmers are realizing that it's in their financial interest to develop their own fertilizer, for example, nitrogen fixing cover crops. That's financially more viable than spending money on fertilizer that has been just more and more expensive. And also, the trend has been that depleted soil needs more and more fertilizer. So it's like an addiction. So many farmers now are getting off of that treadmill. We have a long way to go, 60%, right? But this is definitely a lot of progress.
Já tady doplním, že těch 40%, tam zaznělo, že to je no-till, což je jako bez mechanického zpracování. A zmiňovala Elizabeth, že pouze nějakou částečnou míru regenerativní, takže jako stejně my všichni tady hledáme cesty, to není o tom, že všichni jsou najednou i hned regenerativní, takže v nějaké fázi přechodu se snaží být těch 40% půdy. Dáme, prosím, ruka. Protože, jak jsme slyšeli dříve, no-till samotné nefunguje.
Dobrý den. Já nemám ani tak úplně dotaz, ale velký dík za tu pasáž o tom stresu, to byl Ledas, co vysvětlovalo. A chtěla bych i tady podpořit všechny v sále a tak jako přehodit do pléna. 1500 hektarů, to je upřímně pro mě jako science fiction. Já hospodařím na 40 hektarech v malém údolí. A musím říct, že už to provozuju nějakých 8 let smysluplně regenerativně, zejména pastvu koní a i v tom malém údolí na takhle malé ploše vidím ty změny toho klimatu. Ne, že by tam víc pršelo, ale minimálně co se týče rosy, teploty půdy a toho, že moje půda uživí moje zvířata. Takže tím chci dát podporu všem vystresovaným zemědělcům, že i na malé ploše to má smysl. Děkuji moc za tuhle přednášku.
Já to akorát trochu přeložím. Vy jste říkala na 40 hektarech?
Ano.
So just for you, here a lady said with only 40 hectares of her own place property, she actually can see some effects on the microclimate of the water and heat and temperature regulation. So she thanks for the presentation and agrees.
Děkuji. Dobrovolný spolek ochrany přírody. U nás v přírodě rostou topoly černé italské. To jsou takové ty štíhlé vysoké. Na snímcích z Ameriky těch topolů tam nebylo moc vidět. Děkuji.
A jaká je otázka? Jestli se může...
Proč tam ty topoly nerostou? Jsou štíhlé, nerozbíjí techniku, jsou krásný do přírody. Děkuju.
A víte někdo, jak se řekne topol černý italský?
Černý italský.
Poplar, okay.
Populus nigra italica duroi.
So, gentleman, he mentioned that we have a lot of lines of trees, poplars, and it's poplar nigra italica. So, why are you not using it more in the United States, like as a, I guess, windrows, windshields, when we have it here?
We did at one time. When I was a child, approximately 15 hectare was surrounded by trees. And as farming equipment got larger, people saw those windbreaks as wasted space and they took them out. It was a mistake. We've researched, practical experience shows that those windbreaks are a benefit, especially where we are, where we live. The wind blows all the time, and we lose a lot of moisture and we lose a lot of soil blowing because people have taken those out, and big mistake.
Yeah. So people are replanting windbreaks, and there's a slight crop loss right on the edge of a field, but it's made up for in the rest of the field by the increased moisture. So it's been carefully studied. It's definitely a benefit. And where people have taken them out, they're putting them back. Another very important benefit of a windbreak is that it provides shade and habitat for fungal spores. And fungal spores are the #1 contributor of biogenic aerosols that make that slow and steady rain.
Okay, thank you. Další otázku poprosím. Tady dopředu. Kdo běží, kdo má mikrofon? Jo, ještě tamhle, tak položte otázku.
Díky.
A tady.
Jo, děkuji moc za výbornou přednášku. Já se chci zeptat, jaký je recept na to přesvědčit co nejvíc farmářů v Evropě, aby začali dělat regenerativní zemědělství. Jak se vám to povedlo v Americe? Věřím tomu, že to trvalo mnoho let, ale já taky si myslím, že tady to taky potrvá mnoho let. Zejména starší ročníky mi přijdou absolutně nepřesvědčitelný k tomu, aby něco začali dělat, k tomu, aby se trochu zachránila ta půda. Díky.
So, what is your advice? How to convince people here to start doing the regenerative agricultural practice? The young gentleman here says, especially the older people seem to be very resistant to that idea. So, how do you do that in the US? How do you manage to convince people?
Well, that's a big part of my research, is not just what is good agronomically, but how do we help people make a change? And so we have found that explaining the agronomic benefits and the ecological benefits is not enough. And so for those of you in the audience that want to encourage a neighbor to change, listen to what they're saying, and address anxiety about making a change. Don't just tell people the agronomics. Because again, farming is one of the most high stress occupations on the planet. And when you experience stress over years and years, it makes you physiologically risk. So what all farmers need to know is that when your brain says no, when your whole body feels like it's a bad idea, don't let the lizard brain run your farm. Don't let your fear run your farm. So that practice of facing anxiety is just as important as the agronomics. And again, part of why the change is happening in the United States, there are two very big reasons, is that people are seeing their farms get worse and worse and worse and lose soil. And when that happens, you are on an addictive path with a supplier of fertilizer. So people make the change because they know that down the road, if they don't, they're only going to be losing more money and more soil. So that's a good question, right? It's how do you convince someone to make a change? And the answer is you have to address and recognize that anxiety is normal and help people to literally explain to them that your lizard brain cannot run your farm.
Thank you. And we will take one last question, I think here.
Já bych se chtěl zeptat, my farmaříme na jihu Moravy, teplá oblast, 450 mm srážek a daří se nám celkem s vymrzajícíma meziplodinama, bohatý směsky, přímý setí do toho kukuřice, ale zkoušeli jsme nevymrzající směsky několikrát a nepovedlo se. A tak se chci zeptat, jestli v tom snažení máme pokračovat vzhledem k teplotě a srážkám, anebo jestli máme pokračovat, jestli je prostě nějaká otázka je v podstatě, od jakých srážek funguje tady to přímé setí do nevymrzající směsi mezi plodin, jo, třeba kukuřice, nevymrzající směs.
Okay. So the gentleman here, he runs a quite sizable operation in Moria where it's rather warmer. There is like only 400 millimeters. There is not much rain. And the question basically is, he ran an experiment with cover crops that don't freeze, right? So nevymrzající plodiny, že ano?
Nevymrzající plodiny, s těma je problém, jakože nevymrzající meziplodina, když do toho zasejeme přímo kukuřici, tak to se nám úplně nedaří. Vymrzající meziplodiny, to si myslím, že už nějak zvládáme, ale...
Okay, so when they drill corn into the cover crop that is not frost terminated, they didn't have too much success with that. And he's wondering whether he should keep experimenting with that. Do you have any advice? And basically his question was like, is it like how much rain he needs, what kind of temperature to make this kind of successful to drill corn directly into the frost-resistant cover crop?
Okay. It varies year by year, and with the timing of the rainfall. As I explained in the video, when you plant directly into the growing cover crop, there will always be less moisture, or almost always less moisture at that time. If, however, with each succeeding rainfall after termination of the cover crop, more water goes in, less water evaporates. If you get no rain afterwards, that doesn't matter. So it's about timing. I like to begin in a dry area with cover crops that frost terminate or are killed early to preserve that moisture. And then as you build more and more mulch over time, more plant residue on the soil surface, you can get closer and closer, allow that cover crop to grow closer and closer planting time. And depends on the year. If it's a wet year, you can allow that cover crop to grow longer. If it's a very dry year, you may want to terminate that cover crop earlier. In areas of limited moisture, this actually, regenerative agriculture probably works better in drier areas, but it does take different management. And it's a judgment call each year how soon you need to terminate that cover crop. Very dry areas, sometimes we'll terminate that cover crop 90 days prior to planting the next cash crop. Some years we'll plant directly into a green growing cover crop. It all depends on what the rainfall has been to that point.
Okay.
So the answer is keep it.
Pomohla odpověď?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we are again running out of time, as always, with the Q&As, because it was so interesting. So thank you very much, Elizabeth and Dale, for your contribution today. We greatly appreciate you still being in the middle of the night. Thank you, and have a nice day in the US.
Dobrý den.
Thank you very much.